I also do a lot of spinning from both the kayak and small boats, particularly with bib lures, Rapalas. Rapalas are very good in both the countdowns. Normally I'm using CD6s, I don't tend to go bigger than that. With the countdown you can fish up to 5, 6, 7 metres deep and just cast out and let it get to the depth that you require, which is being just a wee bit off the bottom. The floaters are great for if you're chasing particularly browns around the edges and you're out on a boat and just want to cast in towards maybe a line of rushes or a line of weed or something like that. The floaters are really good because you can cast them out, let it rest for a little bit and then bring it back and just letting it pull down not too far under the surface. That's a floating Rapala. I use these here a lot. This is a love wrap lure, which I've had a couple of them for many years, which float, but that's in the brown trout pattern. It's very unassuming, and I've caught a lot of browns in as little as maybe a foot of water by casting out well ahead, so the splash is a long way ahead of the trout, and then waiting until the fish gets a bit closer and just starting to work it in a bit under the surface. Very effective. That particular lure has been broken and it's all been glued up many times because I've only ever owned 2 of them and both of them have been repaired. Got a lot of fish on them. Places to spin around bays, off weed beds, off river mouths. If you want to go deeper, spin deeper, especially in some of the bigger lakes, then use metal lures or Tassie Devils and count down a long way, a lot longer. I don't tend to fish those places with that method too often. I'll use soft baits or marabou jigs, which I will talk about shortly. But spinning, I use a very light gear, very light spinning rod with 6-pound braid and often just a 4 or 5 pound fluorocarbon leader, and it can be a lot of fun, especially when the fish are quite a good size. Well worth doing. So moving on to fishing with jigs. I do a lot of fishing with jigs, small jigs generally, from both the kayak and my small inflatable. And at times they can be very effective. I fish both soft baits. It's a reasonable size soft bait there, paddle tail. But I also fish a lot with marabou jigs, or sometimes I tie them with rabbit fur, which can be really effective. With the soft baits, the idea is, if you're casting, is to use the lightest jig head you can to get out there and to get to the depth of that you want to. My most common jig head sizes that I use is 1/16 of an ounce and 1/24th or 23rd. It's 24th, I think. But I do go all the way down to 1/32, which is pretty light. In order to cast jig heads that light, I either use a 6-foot, very light 6-foot rod, which is a wee bit short really, but with the 6-pound braid and a very small reel, or I use an 8-foot rod, which I would tend to use 10-pound braid, but I can still flick the very light weights a long way with it. the beauty of a jig over the likes of using Rapalas, and that is you can very much control your depth and the type of action that you require. I catch a lot of fish on these small dam V-tails. A couple of months ago I had a good evening on Lake McGregor where I hooked 3 really nice browns on the little dam V-tails. And I had a 1/16 of an ounce on and was able to work them out and bring them in just over the weed beds, and very effective. Sometimes you can go with a heavier jig head and something like this paddle tail, which has got little slits down things, so when it's going it kind of has, the body has some action as well as just the paddle tail. So that's somewhat more akin to casting a hard body lure, and can be effective, but it's not really as subtle as using some of the smaller ones. Sometimes I use very small curly tails in very natural colours like this. This is on a 132 jig, and there's a little wee curly tail there, and because it's so light I can cast it out, it drop down towards the bottom and then just bring it back up with an action, either with my rod tip or, as I'm going to explain shortly, just winding. There's a whole lot of different ways of using these jigs, and with the marabou jigs, depending on your way you think, it's very similar. The reason I use both marabou jigs and soft baits is there's times when I can catch fish on the marabou and I can't on the soft baits. And my theory as to why that is a soft bait, even though it's not as defined as a hard body lure, it is still reasonably defined. So it still looks reasonably solid under the water and has a definite shape to it. And if it's not what the trout are exactly looking for, I think sometimes it can turn them off. For you guys that are fly fishing, it's a lot like using, say, a herring copper nymph made out of hare's fur or rabbit ear, from the fur from the ear of a rabbit, which is a fly that has a real translucent quality to it, but not a lot of shape. It's not a definite shape as a mayfly or a stonefly nymph. Whereas some other nymphs, you might use a stonefly nymph that is an exact replica, and sometimes if it's not quite right to what you're fishing for, the fish won't take it. But something that, like the herring copper nymph, that just has this kind of general food thing to it, and movement, and isn't too defined, can often get the strike. And I think that's why I like the marabou jigs over the soft baits sometimes, because they waver, they're not as defined, and they're more of a suggestion of food rather than something like this, which really is a replica of a small fish. So that both methods are a lot of fun. Now fishing techniques for both of them, I'll just talk about both the marabous and the soft plastics, is you oftentimes want to be working reasonably close to the bottom, and there's a whole variety of retrieves to look for depending on what you're fishing. Sometimes I fish say a very small little green marabou jig there, where they're feeding on, or brown one where they're feeding on dragonfly nymphs. So I'll fish it with short, small little lifts and drops and lifts and drops, and I do that with the rod tip. The faster the paddle tails, which I tend to wind faster because they have the action in the tail, I also give them I'll give them a twitch more every so often, with my rod. Things like the V-tail, where you're in charge of the complete movement of it, because apart from a waving tail, it doesn't have a huge amount of movement. As you can really play around with twitching, maybe a series of 2 or 3 little twitches, and then let it drop in another little series of twitches. The letting it drop from time to time is really important with all these fishing things, because the trout will often see something on the twitching or whatever you're doing to attract it, but on the drop is when they'll take, which is why it's so important to be watching your braid. I watch my braid on the surface where it's disappearing into the water a lot for little tiny movements, and especially when the lure's dropping, because 9 times out of 10 that's when they'll take. Sometimes if I'm not getting a lot of fish, and just to really get that method of getting them to take on the drop, instead of twitching my rod, I will wind. So I'll hold my rod reasonably steady and I'll go, and then I'll stop, and the lure will go down, and then you wind again, and it's often just as you start to wind that you will get a take. Depending of course on what depth and that you're fishing. One of the beauties of a jig really is you can control your depth very well. If it's only a metre deep, I'll use a light one, and I can cast it out, and I'll keep my rod up a bit, and maybe just keep the retrieve a wee bit faster, and keep that lure moving over the bottom. If it's a bit deeper, I can cast the same one out, count it down a bit longer, and then work it over the bottom, but with longer drops for it to head back down again, so that I'm bringing it in towards the boat, close to the bottom at all times, and that often seems to do the trick. Deep water, normally if I find trout deep, this last season I was at Lake McGregor quite a lot, and the fish were proving very, very difficult. A lot of us with fly rods weren't catching a lot, and that lake only goes to about 12 metres, but I figured that the rainbows are probably sitting out and holding in the deeper water. It was just starting to warm up. I don't think there was a thermocline there, but especially in the daytime they were going deep. So I tend to, in that circumstance, use a jig, and this is an 1/8 ounce jig, so it dives down reasonably quickly, and black with the pink, and this is my favourite jig for chasing those deeper rainbows. I can chase them with soft baits, but again, the jigs are less defined, and they seem to me to do the job more, and I got a few really nice rainbows in Lake McGregor when it had otherwise been very hard fishing with a black marabou jig, not dissimilar to this. Pink is always a good way down deep, because pink, a lot of the colours, as water gets deeper, different colours of the different spectrums lose the ability to show at different depths, and pink still shows up quite a long way down, and then the black puts some shape to it. But marabou jigs aren't used a lot in New Zealand, which I think is a great shame. I've never seen any for sale in a sports shop. I tie them myself, but I won't do a video on tying them, because the Americans use them a lot, and there's a lot of really good videos on YouTube about tying both marabou jigs and hair jigs. A lot of the time I use rabbit jigs. So this is tied very similar to a yellow rabbit fly, but I've got the fur on because the hook goes a different way up, I've tied it so the feather's still on the fly's back. On a standard daytime, the yellow rabbit is a great fly, and when they're in the water, they've just got a lot of action and flow, and very good. If you want to see me using these marabou jigs, there's a video called Kayak Fishing Lake Benmore, and there you'll see me using both the rabbit and the marabou jigs to some effect. Really good. A little bit more about the techniques of using your jigs. A lot depends on wind and where you are, and if it's anything other than really calm, you either need to anchor or use a drogue. I use a drogue quite a bit, and at other times I anchor, and I have different ways of doing it depending where I am. One of my favourite ways is if I might want to work in towards a shore that might have some rushes on the edge, so I want to work my way into fish right up against those rushes. But I'll start out further out, especially if the wind is heading in towards there, and I'll put an anchor out and I'll fish with the wind. Because you're using such light jigs, pays to just about always be casting with the wind. So I'll cast with the wind and work it out, and then I will lift my anchor just a little bit and let the wind drift me in a little closer, and I'll drop my anchor again, and then I'll have another fish, and I'll work my way in as far as I can like that. But it's a really underrated way of fishing in New Zealand. I think the soft baits, there's a tendency in New Zealand to, because everybody's been brought up casting, Tobies and Tassie Devils, to use bigger soft baits with a big jig head and just basically fish them the same as you would any of those other lures. But really, soft baits and marabou jigs, they're a lot more subtle, and if you can really get the subtleties working, the number of fish you're going to catch is going to go up quite a lot. I've got another video online, soft baits in Lake McGregor, where I'm using these little V-tails here, and one night they seem to be taking them quite well. But it's worth having a look at it just to see how I go about using them. There's still a lot of different ways of fishing that I've not done a lot of, want to try a bit more. Drop shots, it has a lot of potential with the soft baits and things, and under floats and bubbles, which I've not done a lot of. Also has a lot of potential. So there's a lot of exciting different ways to fish, rather than just going out and fishing with your good old Tassie Devils, and it's good. And that's about all, I think, at this stage. So yeah, get out there and do it.